Hi everyone, welcome to another Heroes and Bosses video. This time I'm going to be painting the Hellhound from Massive Darkness. This miniature is super easy to remove from the base, so that's the first thing I'm doing. There's a lot of work to do on the Hellhound's underside, and this is going to make things a lot easier in the long run. So the first order of business is to fill in some of the gaps on the Hellhound. There's a large one on his belly. It's unlikely that anyone's going to see it, but there's also quite a few other large gaps around the top part of the body. I'm using liquid green stuff for this. I actually prefer regular green stuff most of the time, but I thought the liquid version might make it easier to get some of the deeper spots. Once that's done, I'm putting some white tack on all the feet that are going to be touching the ground, just to keep them from getting primer on them. I'm going to be priming the underside first, so I'm going to attach the Hellhound to a stick with some more white tack. So you can see here, I'm just sticking a big gob of it to his back so I can prime the belly. You could get away with just wearing a glove and holding on to his mane for this step. I'm going to do a two-tone prime for this miniature, starting with Chaos Black, spraying just the bottom half of the miniature. Before priming with the second color, I'm first going to set up the base to fix that hovering rear foot. I don't know if anyone else has this problem, but if you do, you can just do what I did. Wait until none of your neighbors are out and about, and then crawl around in your driveway until you find the perfect rock. Once I figure out the best place to put it, I'm just going to use some regular PVA glue to hold it down. And if you're going to have one rock, you might as well have one or two others, so it doesn't look out of place. After the glue has had about 20 to 30 minutes to dry, I'm going to prime the base with Army Painter's Uniform Grey. I'm also using a bit of white tack to plug the hole the front left foot is going into. The next step is to put the second color of primer on. First I'm going to dry fit the Hellhound into the base. Then I'm going to spray the grey primer downward at a 45-degree angle, rotating the miniature as I go. This is going to help create a nice shadow effect on the underside of the Hellhound. Once everything is dry, I'm going to start by getting the majority of the work done on the base. I'm starting by covering the entire base with a thin layer of Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now I really could have saved myself some time here and just bought a can of Mechanicus Standard Grey primer, but I've got a lot of Army Painter primer to use up first. Next, I'm going to give a heavy dry brush of Celestra Grey to my rocks. Then I'm going to follow this up with a lighter dry brush of Longbeard Grey. The last thing I'm going to do with the rocks is to give them a wash of Nuln Oil. This is going to tone down some of those highlights which I feel are just a bit too bright. Next I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint on a flagstone pattern. If you have a plan in mind that involves mud or grass when you're doing your base, you don't need to completely cover it with flagstones. I'm not 100% sure yet what I want mine to look like, so I'm just going to cover the whole thing for now. To create a little color variation in the stones, I'm going to mix in a little bit of Rakarth Flesh with my Mechanicus Standard Grey and paint a few stones with that color. I'm also going to paint a few of the stones with some pure Skavenblight Dinge. Now I'm going to start on the body of the Hellhound. To get started, I'm going to put 3 colors onto my wet palette, some Ceramite White, some Mournfang Brown, and finally Dryad Bark. Once they're on there, I'm just mixing in a tiny bit of water. I'm going to start by painting all of the areas that are black with the Dryad Bark. My paint is pretty much at a thick glaze consistency. Painting the underside with a darker color primer is going to help a lot with making the top of the Hellhound brighter, which is where the majority of the flames are found. I'm also being careful here not to paint the bottom of the 3 paws that are going to be glued down later. For all the grey areas of the miniature, I'm going to be using Mournfang Brown. In the regions where the Dryad Bark and the Mournfang Brown meet, I'm going to wet blend the colors together. This is pretty easy to do on this miniature. It's hard to screw it up in any serious way. Just paint the two colors side by side, wipe off your brush, but don't dip it in water, and then just muddle the two colors together where they meet. You're just aiming for a smooth transition from the light to the dark color. Now with the face of the Hellhound, it's a bit hard to tell where the face ends and the flames begin, so just refer to the artwork as a guide. This lighter color is to emphasize the areas lit up by the flames, so I'm also using it on his chest and near the flames on his legs. So here's what the Hellhound looks like so far. You can see there's already a fairly good shadow effect going on with his underside. Next I'm going to use a ceramite white to paint the eyes and the flames on the chest. Eventually any area that is fire is going to be painted with a layer of white. I'm also using ceramite white to paint the inside of the mouth. For the claws, teeth, and jagged armor-looking areas on the Hellhound's legs, I'm using Naggoroth Night. I figured that a fire creature may not have bones, but instead might have something like obsidian. I did consider some other colors, like black for the leg armor and claws, and use shabby bone for the teeth, but in the end I went with a deep purple. The whole time I'm painting this part of the miniature, I'm trying my best to hold on to only the fiery mane of the Hellhound. I'm going to touch this area up later with some white primer. Next, I'm going to paint the flames on the chest of the Hellhound. I'm using ceramite white once again, and this is going to take 2 thin layers. You want a really bright white under your flames, otherwise the yellow is going to have a strange gray-green tint to it. Before I start the flame colors, I'm first going to shade all the brown areas of the Hellhound with a 50-50 mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. This step could also be done before you start painting any of the ceramite white, but it's not essential. Just do your best to avoid getting any shade in the eyes. We're going to use a different color shade on the eyes later. Now I'm going back to the wet palette. This time I'm adding Daemonic Yellow by Army Painter, some Heartfire by P3, which is just a very light orange, and some Lava Orange, also by Army Painter. I'm going to start off by painting the entirety of the white flames with the Daemonic Yellow. This part may also take 2 coats to get a nice strong base color. Let the yellow dry for a minute or 2 and then add the next darkest color, in my case, Heartfire. This will cover most of the yellow areas, but I'm leaving some of the regions closest to the body yellow. You don't need to wait for this to dry before you start adding the Lava Orange. In fact, you want to wet blend it into your lighter orange. Just add a small amount at a time, then slowly darken the regions of flame furthest from the body. Here I'm just going back to my Heartfire and smoothing the transition between the light and the dark orange. Now that the underside of the Hellhound is done, I'm going to reattach it to the base. One of the back feet is still a bit elevated from the ground, so I'm going to put a small pile of Stirland Mud under where that foot is going to go. Then I'm going to spread some mud around, just to add a little variety to the texture on the base. Next I'm going to add a bit of super glue to the front and rear left leg of the Hellhound and attach them to the base. Then I'm going to give this guy 20 to 30 minutes for the glue and the Stirland Mud to harden. Once everything is dry, it's time to paint the rest of the flames. The first thing to do is to paint all the remaining areas of fire with a couple coats of ceramite white, or you could even just use some white primer. As long as you start and finish in the same places with both coats, you shouldn't need to give the paint any extra drying time in between these coats. For the flames on the head, I'm going to be using 4 main colors. The first is Daemonic Yellow, just like before. Give the entire mane of fire good coverage and let it dry before starting with the next color. This is the only color I'm going to let dry. The rest are going to be wet blended together. Next, I'm going to start in with some pure Heartfire. This is the point where you should decide how hot you want your flames to look. If you want cooler, more smoky flames, then you'll want to paint almost all of the flames with your orange. I prefer hotter looking flames, so I'm leaving about 20% of the flames yellow. Remember that the flames are hottest and brightest near the source, in this case the body of the Hellhound. Now I'm switching back to the Daemonic Yellow, and I'm just going to muddle the edges where the yellow and the orange meet. The great thing about painting fire is that it's hard to mess up wet blending. The next color I'm using is a 2-to-1 mix of Lava Orange and Daemonic Yellow. I'm painting roughly 50% of the mane with this. With each new color, I'm starting at the back and working my way forward until I get a look that I like. I'm also wet blending the edges of the new orange with some more Heartfire. Finally, I'm using some pure Lava Orange. Now if you're going to go for a darker looking flame, you'll want to use a 5th color after this, perhaps some Citadel Corn Red. The last step of the flames is to add some dark tips to the furthest points. I've seen some people use dark brown or black paint thinned down to a glaze, but I prefer a 1-to-1 mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. Just be careful not to let the wash sink into any of the recesses of your flames. Now we just need to repeat this process with all the remaining fiery areas, and I won't bore you by showing you all those steps over again. Next I'm going to paint the eyes and the mouth. I'm going to start off by painting both with a layer of Daemonic Yellow. For the mouth, I'm going to follow the same paint scheme as the flames, with the deepest part of the mouth remaining yellow and darkening the colors the closer I get to the tip of the tongue. For the eyes, I'm going to do something a bit different. First, I'm going to give each eye a thick layer of Fugan Orange shade. Then I'm going to siphon off the Fugan Orange from the center of each eye. This will leave the center of the eye yellow and the edges a nice orange color. Now it's time to start some of the highlighting. The Hellhound isn't going to require a lot of highlighting, but I'm going to try to emphasize the brightness of the areas on top of the miniature, and especially the regions closest to the flames. I'm starting with a 1-to-1 mix of Naggoroth Night and Xereus Purple for the claws, teeth, and the uppermost parts of the armored areas of the legs. At this point I also realized there were 2 horns on the Hellhound's head, so I'm going to paint both of these first with pure Naggoroth Night, and then highlight the top part of them with a lighter purple mix. Next, I'm going to do a much smaller edge highlight using some pure Xereus Purple. This is going to go on the teeth, the horns, and the edges of the leg armor. The final highlight is only going to be on the tips of the teeth and the horns. For this, I'm using a 1-to-1 mix of Genestealer Purple and Xereus Purple. For the skin, I'm only going to focus on the areas that the light from the flames will be touching. I'm going to start off by reapplying a very thin layer of Mournfang Brown to all the areas already painted that color. I'm also going to add some of this to any areas that are close to a flame. My Mournfang Brown is thinned to a glaze with water. There are tiny pebble-looking bumps on the shoulders and hips that I'm just going to paint around. I'm also using this to highlight the tops of the feet and any other areas that I want to stand out. Here I'm lightening up the area of the chest surrounded by flames, as well as the underside of the tail that's also near firelight. If you're not comfortable doing highlights, all of this is optional. The two-tone prime we started with has already created some nice shadows, but as long as you're working with thin layers of paint, it's a fairly simple process. After 2 layers of the Mournfang Brown, I'm adding in a small amount of XV88 to lighten up my highlights. I'm only using this on the areas that are nearly touching a flame and on the face, which I want to really stand out. The final step in highlighting is to do a bit of counter shading. I'm just going to use a bit of Nuln Oil to darken up any areas that I don't think have enough shadow. In the artwork, the Hellhound has a black nose, so I'm using a small amount of dead black for this. With the Hellhound complete, it's time to put a few finishing touches on the base. I'm going to add a bit more texture with some Citadel Sand. First, I'm going to use a mix of PVA glue and water on some random areas around the Stirland Mud. Next, I'm just sprinkling some of the sand on all the glued areas and then giving this about a half hour to dry. Using a 1-to-1 mix of water and Steel Legion Drab, I'm going to paint all of the Stirland Mud and Citadel Sand. After that's dried, I'm washing the entire area with Agrax Earthshade. Then I'm going to water down the Earthshade and spread this all over the rest of the base, just to give the flagstones a more weathered, dirty look. Again, I'll let that dry, then finish up the dirt with a dry brush of Xandri dust, doing my best not to hit the rocks. Now I'm just touching up some of my black lines with some dead black. For the rim of my base, I'm using a mix of Eshin Grey and dead black. Next, I'm going to give the entire miniature a good coat of Tester's Dull Coat. The final touch I'm giving this miniature is a bit of moss and grass. I'm using Hobby Scenics Summer Blend and some Citadel Grass in random patches. And And here's the final product. I hope you enjoyed this video and thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, there's a lot more Massive Darkness on the way.